You're right that I was embarrassed at Washington, not that we were treated badly, Your Excellency. I wanted just to clarify. But you see, when you find African countries queuing in corridor, then you are called one by one. Nigeria, you come, 15, 30 minutes. Rwanda, Kenya, I mean, for those of us who have some pride, it's a bit demeaning. And you see the money that we are asking for out there, Your Excellency, if we just tighten our system, we can do without some of these monies. We can do. Because today, IMF has released 78 billion shillings. But if KRA puts systems in place, we can collect not less than 400 billion shillings. So we can do without some.
What exactly is the IMF asking for? They're pushing for the CBDCs to go on in different countries. They're just, you know, they have their footing in many different places. Is it your food? Is it your housing? This is the IMF we're talking about. Now, cuts to food and energy subsidies, as well as a reduction in the public wage bill, among others. This is the IMF. Elsewhere in West Africa, a certain president has sold his country for IMF's $3 billion by raising taxes and an absurd haircut on people's investments. The Tunisian president, Kais Saied, has rejected the foreign diktats from the International Monetary Fund, which is in stalled talks with a heavily indebted country over a bailout package. Now, the IMF has pushed Tunisia to remove the state subsidies as basic goods, particularly fuel. This is exactly the kind of leaders African countries need at the moment. There was once a Gaddafi, but unfortunately, the enemies outnumbered his cabinet.
What do you want? You want us to sell Tunisia? Tunisia is not for sale. Foreign dictates that will lead to more poverty are unacceptable. The world must understand, as well as the financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, that human beings are not figures or a set of numbers for subtraction and addition.
So the IMF prioritizes the interests of wealthy countries and corporations over the needs of developing nations and ordinary people, leading to policies that exacerbate inequality, social welfare, and economic instability. I will not be surprised if freedom is on its way. Tunisia's president speaks the truth in this video. Now, the IMF doesn't care about people's welfare now, does it? They impoverish countries through unrealistic action plans. It is clear now that they humiliate and weaken countries through these horrible loans. In a speech released on April the 6th, to be delivered at the 2023 spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group in Washington, the IMF director, Kristalina Georgieva, shockingly voiced that Africa is facing a tremendous financial crunch and is being held back by unsustainable debt built over the years. However, her solution to the problem isn't without contradictions. So this idea raises questions about the sustainability of continuing to take on more debt to solve an already existing debt problem. The director also praised the African countries for raising taxes on wealthy individuals and, of course, businesses. And she said she is seeing positive development in the resource mobilization, a move that some economists argue hinders growth in the private sector. So despite these contradictions, Georgieva pretended to be positive about Africa's future. Many investors say that IMF economic policies failed to address the global inequality and instead have contributed to exacerbating it, contending that policies often favor the politically connected and the super wealthy rather than the general public.
Good evening, Africans. I hope you're doing fine where you are, and if you're not doing fine, please do fine where you are. Today I have a question I want to ask you, a very simple question. How low would you stoop for someone just because you need something from them? I mean, every metal has a boiling point, right? Every human being has their limits as well. But you personally, how low will you stoop for someone else just because you need something from them? Perhaps you need help with medication, you need to go do one or two things. How low will you stoop for someone to help you? This is a question that is challenging many African leaders today, the challenge of how low will they stoop.
Makes African and third world debt different from the American debt. Number one, America is never going to pay its debts. It doesn't have to. Its debts are in its own currency. We can simply print it. The African debt is not in its currency. The African debt is in U.S. dollars. Africa has to earn the U.S. dollars, and the only way it can earn the U.S. dollars is not to be assassinated for growing its own food and becoming independent and doing something that the United States does not like. The principle underlying the foundation of the World Bank is that no country should grow its own food. Africa and the third world should only grow export crops. In order to have an oversupply of cocoa and other tropical raw materials, to keep down the price, they must buy their grain from the United States or Europe, so that if they do something that we don't like, we can do what America tried to do to China in the 60s. We can sanction them. We can say, we're going to starve you. I think the most evil organizations in the world today are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
We don't have insufficiency. We have abundance. We have a lot. When God made this world, He made this world enough for the population that will always exist concurrently and those succeeding others. People die for others to be born again. Those who died had their own sufficiency. Those who live today have their own sufficiency. But why is it that it's always lacking? Why is it that we find insufficiency in abundance? Every day, Africans, we are complaining. We don't have. Look at the Congo. Look at Niger. Look at Kenya, my own country. Look at Nigeria. Look at Ghana. Look at South Africa. Look at Egypt. Look at Morocco. Look at, name it, just name it. Every country has a resource that is enough to bail it out of poverty. Even with this abundance, African leaders are still putting themselves in the position of stooping too low for the Europeans. They're stooping too low just because they need favor. And this favor, when they are granted it, they don't even do what that favor calls for it to do. African leaders are going to the West, they are going to the IMF and the World Bank, they are going to borrow money from those institutions. And those institutions do not respect African leaders. They are not respected at all. Africa is the continent that almost powered Europe. Look at Africa itself. The leaders have made it such a poor country. It's like a country. Africa is like a country to me. Because when a black person walks outside here, I can't tell if it's Nigerian or Kenyan. I can't tell. Maybe until they speak is when I'll tell, okay, from your accent, I can deduce that you are of this origin country. But deep inside, we are one people. And African leaders are really shaming Africans outside there. Now, there is this political leader in Africa, in Kenya, to be specific. He narrates how Africans are being oppressed. He narrates how African leaders are being made to beg for money and how they're lined up like children who are to be fed. Africans, we have enough and we don't need to face such kind of humiliation. Let's listen to what this man has to say. And then by the end of the video, I shall give you my thoughts, where we shall also have a deep critical analysis. Let's dive in.
Nigeria has taken another IMF loan, this time for $2.5 billion, bringing Nigeria's total debt obligations to over $110 billion. I don't like this deal at all for Nigeria, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this is more of an economic hitman type move, and I'm going to explain why. The terms of this IMF loan may seem fair at first glance. It's a $2.5 billion loan at 1% interest rate that will be paid off over 40 years, with no payment due for over 10 years. But here's the problem. The loan needs to be paid back in Western currencies, and the Naira is losing significant value every year. meaning this loan is going to end up costing tens of billions of dollars to Nigeria within a decade. From an economic sense, the effective interest rate would be 1% plus the depreciation of the naira relative to the US dollar. In the past year, the naira depreciated 50%, meaning the interest rate would be 51% if the naira depreciation continues. This is an economy-destroying debt obligation, of course because payments don't start until 2034, when all the current politicians will be long gone when the loan starts to come due. I can understand why this was a tempting loan to take. But let's say the naira depreciation is only 10% per year, which is very generous. Even in this best-case scenario, that means by 2034, the principal in this loan will effectively grow from $2.5 billion to $7 billion. The payments will then be the equivalent of $1 billion a year and continue for 30 years. So for $2.5 billion today, Nigeria is agreeing to pay the Western banks $30 billion under a 10% inflation rate. But even the loan itself comes with other concessions that should worry Nigerians. Nigeria will have to keep a large portion of this money as foreign reserves, so they can't even spend much of it. They also need to end subsidies on oil, which will hurt their economy, and they will need to enact reforms which will make it easier for Western banks to compete with the domestic Nigerian banks. I understand that in many ways the current administration inherited these problems. However, the terms of this IMF loan will contribute to long-term insolvency. Nigeria has far too many assets, both in raw resources and a talented labor pool, to be in this debt spiral. And the longer they stay reliant on Western banks, the longer Nigeria will operate below their economic potential. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think Nigeria should have taken this loan and agreed to the reforms that came along with it? Or should Nigeria have taken the more difficult path of breaking away from IMF loans? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if this video brought value to you, give me a like and a follow.
The International Monetary Fund, IMF, was set up as a crisis lender in 1944 after the world's Great Depression of 1930s and World War II. During that period, international trade fell by 30%. In July 1944, representatives of 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, a town in USA's New Hampshire state, to agree on an international monetary system to aid in post-war recovery. In December 1945, the IMF, which has its headquarters in USA's capital, Washington, D.C., officially began operations. The earliest member nations of the IMF include the United States, the United Kingdom, China, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa. The IMF is a crisis lender. This means it does not lend for projects such as building of roads. Instead, it offers loans to countries facing economic crisis. These challenges are often caused by inappropriate monetary policies or external factors such as natural disasters. However, the IMF loans do come with conditions. The lender has come under sharp criticism over its loan conditions, especially on developing countries in Africa. On several occasions, the IMF has demanded that borrower countries privatize state-owned companies as well as discontinue subsidy programs. Studies show these demands have plunged citizens of borrower countries deeper into debt. The IMF is also accused of doing little to monitor whether allocated funds were prudently used. Today, the IMF has a total of 190 member countries. Each of the nations is represented on IMF's executive board based on the country's financial importance. Currently, the IMF has financial resources worth about $1 trillion. The total amount owed to IMF as of June 2024 was $147 billion. Out of the 94 countries that owe IMF funds, 48 are from Africa. Egypt owes IMF the most in Africa with a loan portfolio of $10.3 billion. The other African countries whose loans are above $2 billion are Angola, Ghana, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire. Others with over $1 billion in loans are Nigeria, Cameroon, the DRC, Morocco, Senegal, and South Africa. Globally, Argentina is the most indebted country to the IMF. It owes nearly $32 billion. The question often asked is, where does the IMF get its money? IMF's funds mainly come from member countries. Each member is allocated a quota, which is the maximum amount of money it can contribute based on how the IMF classifies its economy. Developed nations have much higher quotas. For instance, USA's is over 830,000, while Kenya is 6,900. Quotas are a key determinant of the voting power at the IMF as well. The US, Japan, China, Germany, France, and the UK have the most shares. The IMF also gets an income from interest it charges on loans. Currently, the lender charges as high as over 8% annually in interest. Wealthy member states can pump more funds to IMF under an agreement called New Agreements to Borrow, which is another funding model for the IMF. Countries in need of loans can then get funding from the extra money pumped in. Interest charged on the borrower countries is then added to the wealthy nations' quotas, further raising their shares. Countries can also repay loans using gold. Today, the IMF holds over 2,800 metric tons of gold. The IMF's standard currencies are the US dollar, euro, Chinese yuan, Japanese yen.
It's funny and it's true what the Kenyan politician or the Kenyan African leader, whichever way you choose to call him, has said. Whatever he said there was stupidly true. Yes, very true, and it's hurting so many, but it's the truth. The truth is the truth no matter what. Let's have a glimpse at this IMF, how it came to be, and why is it that Africans do not really need to rely on it. We have enough to rely on ourselves, but not the IMF, because of the embarrassment that it comes with it, and the ultimatums that comes with borrowing money from the IMF. So the IMF has been a prominent player in the global financial system since its creation in the 20th century. It was intended to provide financial assistance to countries in economic distress. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has often been a lender. The IMF has often been a lender to African nations. However, this relationship has sparked significant criticism, like the one we've just seen, as the conditions attached to the IMF loans have frequently come with implication that many African leaders and citizens view as disrespectful, intrusive, and harmful to a long-term development. Now, what's the history and what's the purpose of this IMF? Because whenever Africans are thinking of development, they don't think of development outside the IMF. We think of development within the boundaries of the IMF. So this institution was established in 1944 during the Bretton Woods Conference, which brought together 44 allied nations during World War II to sign a design framework for a post-war economic stability. The primary goal of the IMF was to promote international monetary cooperation, stabilize exchange rates, facilitate balanced trade, and provide financial resources to countries experiencing economic difficulties. The idea was to create an institution that could prevent economic crises like the Great Depression of the 1930s and help countries avoid destructive economic policies such as competitive devaluation and protectionism. Initially, the IMF's purpose was to help countries manage balance of payments crisis. Initially, the IMF purpose was to help countries balance the payment crisis by providing short-term financial assistance in exchange for policies reforms aimed at restoring economic stability. The IMF has played a stabilizing role during the early post-war period, helping European countries rebuild their economies. However, as colonial powers collapsed and newly independent nations emerged, particularly in Africa and Asia, the IMF's role expanded to include developing countries which often faced structural economic challenges that hindered growth and stability. So the IMF was mostly made for the white people, the European countries, but since they gained their stability, issues came with the end of the Second World War. We had nations forming. The IMF seek to expand because it was to protect the stability and to maintain a good economic background for those countries that suffered the losses of the Second World War. So we had to have countries such as after the end of the Second World War, we had to have countries emerge. The countries that emerged are countries that brought about IMF to expand itself to reach up to Africa. Now, why did African countries borrow from the IMF? why do we still borrow up to now? African countries began turning to the IMF in significant numbers in the early 1970s and 80s. During this period, many African nations experienced economic challenges due to various factors, including the oil crisis, falling commodity prices, high level of external debt, and inefficient economic policies. As these countries struggled with large budget deficits, rising inflation, and trade imbalances, they sought financial assistance from the IMF to stabilize their economies. IMF loans provided these countries with much-needed funds to manage immediate economic crisis. However, these loans came with strict conditions known as structural adjustment programs that required borrowing countries to adopt specific economic policies. The IMF argument was that these policies often involved austerity measures that would help countries achieve sustainable growth and reduce dependence on external financing. However, these structural adjustments were generally based on a Western economic model that did not consider the unique political, economic, and social context of many African countries. Now, the IMF was giving money to Africa with a number of conditions. You understand? Now, IMF loans typically come with conditions that require borrowing countries to implement structural reforms, such as reducing government spending, liberalizing trade, privatizing state-owned enterprise, and removing subsidies. These conditions have often been criticized as disrespectful to African nations for several reasons. The first one is erosion of African sovereignty. The first one is erosion of economic sovereignty. The second one is social impact of austerity measures. Now, these IMF required austerity measures, which often include cuts to social services such as healthcare, education, and social welfare programs. The third one would be promotion of privatization and market liberalization. The fourth one would be debt dependency and the vicious cycle of borrowing. Now, what are some of the examples of IMF conditionalities and their impact on African countries? We have examples of countries that the IMF imposed their conditions on them. The first one is Ghana, and this happened in the early 1980s. Ghana implemented IMF-backed structural adjustment programs that included currency devaluation, public sector layoffs, and cuts to social spending. While these reforms brought some economic growth, they also led to increased poverty and inequality, as many Ghanaians lost access to healthcare, education, and employment. Another example is in Zambia. In the early 1990s, Zambia undertook IMF-recommended reforms, which included the privatization of its mining sector. This led to the sale of copper mines to foreign companies at undervalued prices, depriving the country of significant revenue and exacerbating unemployment and social unrest. While intended to boost efficiency, these policies often placed control of Zambia's resources in foreign hands. The last one here, as my example, is Kenya. This happened in the early 2000s. Kenya agreed to IMF condition that required reduction in public spending, especially in education and employment. The resulting budget cuts led to teachers' shortages, declining educational quality, and diminished access to healthcare services, negatively impacting the country's social development. Now, there is a need for criticism and calls for reform. The IMF approach to lending in Africa has drawn criticism from economists, activists, and African leaders. Critics argue that the IMF's one-size-fits-all model, based on Western economic policies, fails to address the unique challenges faced by African nations. What works for Europe does not work for Africa, and what works for Africa does not work for Europe. But they want the policies of Europe, in which the IMF has been built on, to work here in Africa. It has been tested and it has been seen. It doesn't work well and it is not thriving. You understand? Now, there is also a growing advocacy for debt forgiveness and restructuring. As many African countries struggle under crushing debt burdens, this movement argues that the IMF should focus on sustainable development rather than forcing countries into policies that undermine their social and economic well-being. Some African nations are also exploring alternative financial partnership, such as the South-South Cooperation and the regional economic alliances, to reduce dependency on the IMF. To conclude, the IMF was established to foster global economic stability that has mixed. To conclude, the IMF was established to foster global economic stability, which has had a mixed impact on Africa. While its loans have provided financial relief during times of crisis, the conditions attached to these loans have often led to economic, social, and political challenges that African leaders and citizens view as disrespectful and intrusive. IMF-imposed structural adjustment programs have eroded economic sovereignty, exacerbated poverty, and entrenched debt dependency, often without delivering sustainable growth. For African countries to achieve true economic independence, reforms to the IMF approach, along with more For African countries to achieve true economic independence, reforms to the IMF approach, along with more equitable and context-specific policies, are extremely essentials. Yes, reforms needs to be made, and it all boils to one thing. Africans, we have enough for ourselves. We don't need to go to the IMF to borrow. Borrowing only brings a lot of disrespect. And you know, African leaders, they do not like disrespect. African leaders won't want to be disrespected. That is one thing you need to understand. We have enough for us to trade, for us to thrive. We don't need even the Western technology. What we have here is enough for us. The IMF is just using money to bring their hands and take the resources from the Africans by law. They hide with the law, they hide behind facts. And now when somebody approaches you in such format, you use the policy of use fire to fight fire. They come to you by the law, you fight them by the law. For these reasons, Africans need to elect good leaders. This is very, very important. Good leaders are essential. Good leaders should be elected based on their background. We should understand each leader's background and know what they've done in the past. After knowing their past, we can easily predict their future. You understand? Now, this is all I can say for this time. If you have anything you want to share, kindly leave it in the comment section. I will so much appreciate. See you in the next one, and thank you for supporting us. This is EFK Original Documentaries. See you in the next one.